Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Nick Miles, and at 13 hours GMT on Tuesday the 14th of August, these are our main stories. Reports from Italy suggest dozens of people may have died when part of a road bridge collapsed in Genoa. There's been a suspected terror attack outside the Houses of Parliament in central London. Several people have been injured and one man's been arrested. And
I returned to find that my house had disappeared, swallowed up by the mountain. I felt like my whole world had ended.
Sierra Leone marks a year since a mudslide that killed more than 1,000 people. Also in this podcast, Turkey's trade war with America cranks up as Russia gives its support to Ankara. And
doctors, dentists, surgeons, professors, teachers, lawyers, they're all emigrating en masse. Millions of ordinary Venezuelans are emigrating.
One of our listeners in Venezuela tells us how people are struggling to cope with economic turmoil. We begin with the collapse of part of a motorway bridge in northwestern Italy, near the city of Genoa. As we came into the studio, the Italian government said that at least 11 people had died. This man was filming the bridge as it collapsed and is heard repeatedly shouting, "Oh God." A number of vehicles were on the bridge and appear to have fallen from a height of about 100 metres. Shortly before we recorded this podcast, I asked Danny Eberhard, our Europe regional editor, what was known about the collapse.
Some video footage has emerged which seems to show a tower holding up this high suspension bridge collapse in stormy weather. It's not exactly clear what happens, but police have also linked it to a violent cloudburst in the area. Now, we know that a number of vehicles, lorries and cars have collapsed down onto the ground below. The area itself is a semi-industrial and semi-residential area over train tracks, river, but also blocks of flats. Some of these residential areas seem to have escaped the worst of the damage, but the emergency services are on the scene already. The government's talking about 11 people having died at least, but the head of the local emergency services have talked of tens of victims.
Yeah, as you said, it's very difficult to tell from the pictures that are coming out exactly where all the parts of this sizable bit of bridge fell. Dozens of metres of bridge came down. We're hearing the Italian Transport Minister Danilo Toninelli said it was likely to be an immense tragedy, but it will take, I imagine, many hours to discover how many people were killed on the ground.
Absolutely. You see footage of the emergency workers trying to free people or searching crushed and semi-crushed cars. There's teams with dogs on the area to search in the rubble. These are huge sections of heavy concrete, so it's a major, major disaster. We, at this stage, obviously don't know what exactly has caused the collapse. We do know that the motorway has had problems in the past. There was restructuring work a couple of years ago. It dates back to the 60s, so investigators will no doubt be looking at that.
Our Europe regional editor, Danny Eberhard. Here in London, police are investigating a suspected terror attack after a man drove into a security barrier outside the Houses of Parliament. It happened just after 7:30 this morning, injuring 2 people. Eyewitnesses said a car hit a group of cyclists before accelerating into the barrier. Barry Williams saw what happened.
I heard a commotion and turned round to see a silver car heading towards the cyclists on the wrong side of the road. They were parked waiting for the lights to change. He hit the cyclist, then swerved over towards where the safety barrier is, where the police make sure cars go through, and accelerated and hit it at quite high speed.
Police have arrested the driver, said to be a man in his 20s. Here's the Assistant Commissioner of London's police force, Neil Basu.
There is no intelligence at this time of further danger to Londoners or the rest of the UK connected to this incident. Our priority now is to formally establish the identity of the suspect and establish his motivation if we can. He is not currently cooperating.
Our London correspondent Rob Watson, who's at Westminster, told me more about the incident and the man who's under arrest.
Well, we know that he's not cooperating. That's what the police say, and I guess what we read into that is they're trying to find out why did he did it, who exactly is he, and he's not cooperating. So I think they have some idea of who he is. They certainly say that he's in his 20s, and they've also added that from what they know so far, there's no intelligence to suggest from this incident that there's somehow some kind of raised threat of danger here in London or anywhere else. I guess the other key things to note, there was nobody else found in the car, nobody else in the area, and there were no weapons found.
It does look from the pictures of this car up against these barriers that it was the security that was ramped up after a similar attack last year, a more deadly attack last year, that perhaps prevented the car getting through to the Houses of Commons themselves.
It's certainly the case, Nick, that if you had to pick a target in the UK that was well defended, you'd be hard-pressed to find somewhere better protected than Parliament, whether in terms of physical barriers, some which have been there from before the attack last June that you were talking about that claimed 5 lives and a policeman, and in terms of the police presence. And I thought one of the things that was incredibly striking about this incident was just how quickly armed officers were on the scene.
Rob Watson, our London correspondent. The Afghan Defence Ministry says Taliban militants have taken over an army base in northern Faryab province after 2 days of heavy fighting. At least 17 soldiers have been killed and 15 wounded during the attack. Here's Shoaib Sharifi.
Local officials told the BBC the Taliban stormed the base in Roar March from different directions, killing and wounding many of the 100 soldiers stationed there. The governor of the area, Naqibullah Fayek, told the BBC up to 50 soldiers had to surrender because they did not receive reinforcements. 5 days ago, the Taliban attacked and captured parts of Ghazni, a strategically important city south of Kabul. Afghan security forces have since been trying to force the Taliban out, and the government says it's now in control.
Shoaib Sharifi reporting. A year ago today, after 3 days of torrential rain, there was an enormous mudslide just outside the capital of Sierra Leone, Freetown. More than 1,000 people were killed and many more were left homeless. Our correspondent Umaru Fafana has been finding out how those who survived the tragedy are coping.
If I do you wrong, please, I beg, forgive me.
Remembering their dead, for those left behind, the pain is still fresh. Maliki Kamara lost his wife, 2 children and dozens of other relatives. He's back to pray for their souls. But all he could do was weep.
I woke up before my morning prayer, and as a driver, I went out to work. It was only later that I was told about the mudslide. I returned to find that my house had disappeared, swallowed up by the mountain. I felt like my whole world had ended. After performing the 7th-day funeral rites, I received a telephone call from the central hospital that my son was still alive.
This is Maliki's son Daniel, learning to walk on crutches. They live in an unfinished building not far from the scene of the disaster. Daniel survived, but by the skin of his teeth. The scars are all over his body. His left leg has been amputated to the thigh, while his right thigh bone also broke and is still being mended. His left arm is only hanging, while the backhand is scarred. So is his back. As he recalls the names of friends he used to play with who died in the mudslide, Daniel laments that he is no longer able to play like he used to.
We were home sleeping. At around 6 o'clock, my father woke me up for morning prayers. Then he left. At this time, there was a heavy storm. Not long after, I looked for my mum, but I could not find her. I wanted to go outside to look for her. That was when I felt something lifting me up and crash-landing me on a rock. I screamed, calling for help. My leg and arm were broken. This other leg was smashed. This is not how I was born. I can no longer run around and play like other children do. I don't feel happy about it, but I remain courageous.
Thousands were left displaced. A remote village called 6 Mile, some 90 minutes drive from Freetown, is now home to dozens of them. Built at no cost to the state is asking them for a rent. But that is only one of many challenges confronting them. 73-year-old retired banker and accountant Eric Jusu lost the retirement home he built. He is now the chairman of this new community.
We do not have water supply at all. We don't have schools for our children, no hospital facilities, no marketplace to buy our foodstuff. We cannot cope with this situation.
Eric Jusel ending that report from Freetown by Umara Fofana. Still to come in this podcast.
People don't understand. They just throw it and they think it'll disappear. It's like a riptide of plastic all along the coast of India, everywhere. In the city, our drains are clogged with plastic.
A report from Kolkata on India's immense problem with plastic waste. President Erdogan says Turkey will boycott US electronic goods amid an escalating dispute with Washington. Mr. Erdogan has been angered over a decision by President Trump to increase tariffs on aluminium and steel, contributing to falls in the Turkish currency, the lira. And the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's visiting Ankara, has weighed in on Turkey's side. He said sanctions on Russia and Turkey were illegitimate and were a way for Washington to obtain an unfair competitive advantage in global trade. As our defence and diplomatic correspondent Jonathan Marcus explained to me, this is about far more than just trade.
It does go far wider. I mean, there is a basic dispute between Mr. Trump and President Erdogan. The Americans want to see an American pastor resident in Turkey who's been detained allegedly for involvement in the coup against the government there. They want to see him released. Similarly, the Turks want to see a banker and some other individuals released from confinement in the United States. So that's the immediate problem. But of course, the roots of this dispute go much deeper. They relate to Turkey and America's differing views on what should happen in Syria. They relate to differences over where Turkey should buy its weaponry, and also a fundamental sense that Turkey's authoritarian rule under Mr. Erdogan is taking it in a direction perhaps away from the West, away from the NATO alliance. Turkey was, some decades ago, likely to be on a path to joining the European Union. That, I think, now that road has ended. It's clear that the authoritarian drift in Turkey has really put pay to that idea. Now, of course, the Europeans are more and more concerned about Turkey, but of course they need Turkey because Turkey is an important tap controlling the flow of migrants into the European Union. So there are tensions there too. But I think it's the kind of geostrategic position of Turkey that is causing many of the problems, but also, of course, is one of the reasons why for so long it's been anchored in the West. The other dispute, which relates to Russia, is, of course, the decision by the Turks to buy an air defense system from Russia. That's upset the Americans. They've put on hold for the moment the sale of American F-35 jets to Turkey. So it's ramifying now in a number of directions with two very strong-minded, very aggressive leaders, Mr. Trump and Mr. Erdogan, now going toe-to-toe.
Jonathan Marcus, our defence and diplomatic correspondent. In Australia, a former Archbishop of the Catholic Church who's been found guilty of concealing crimes of child sex abuse will serve his one-year sentence at home. Magistrates cited health reasons for this decision. Philip Wilson was convicted for failing to report the repeated sexual abuse of two altar boys by a priest named James Fletcher in the 1970s. Wilson was an assistant priest at the time. Peter Gogarty was one of those abused by James Fletcher and gave Dan Damon his reaction to the news that Philip Wilson will serve his sentence at home.
The story is that Archbishop Wilson knew about a pedophile priest as far back as 1976. He had, I think at last count, at least 12 victims who he preyed upon sexually. Archbishop Wilson knew what that priest was up to in 1976, and for someone like me, by then Fletcher was abusing me, but Archbishop Wilson could have stopped him, could have got me some help. We've had people right across this area directly impacted, but also the families of a lot of those people. There's been so much grief come out of this. People who believed in the Catholic Church, who have had that belief and trust so badly betrayed. And for me, this is a lifelong sentence of trying to deal with the demons left behind by a pedophile priest, and the knowledge that somebody could have helped me it eats away at me.
Peter, how did the church in Australia, how did the church worldwide, it seems, get into this situation, and why can't they deal with it, so it seems to people like you and many others, why can't they deal with it properly?
I'm not a religious person, but I routinely ask myself, particularly when dealing with this issue, what would Jesus do? And I am permanently perplexed that the Catholic Church does not seem to have asked itself that question. And quite the contrary, the Church has sought to protect its own interests, the interests of its priests, its pedophile priests, and perhaps its assets, and maybe tragically that this is about money more than anything else. But I cannot believe that a so-called Christian institution can have put its own interests ahead of vulnerable children. As I said, I can only say I'm perplexed and I don't see any answer.
What would have been, from your point of view, a proper sentence for Philip Wilson?
Look, I really think, and it's not a matter of me being vindictive, but I think a custodial sentence in prison would have been an appropriate sentence. We need to think about the consequences of what Archbishop Wilson has done and also what Archbishop Wilson represents. And for Archbishop Wilson to get home detention where he can eat what he wants, watch as much TV as he wants, have people deliver him wine or anything else that he needs, while people like me and others have suffered for decades, I think sends a very poor message, and it must surely be a disincentive for police and prosecutors to pursue any more of these matters. So it just seems manifestly unjust and insufficient.
That was Peter Gogoty, a former victim of child sexual abuse by a Catholic priest, speaking to Dan Damon. Venezuela is to scale back its decades-long policy of fuel subsidies as it struggles to rein in inflation rates of close to 1 million%. The subsidies have made the country one of the cheapest places to drive in the world. But from now on, the government says that if you want cheap fuel, you'll have to have a state ID card and register your car in a government census. Many in Venezuela fear it's a way of hitting opponents of President Nicolas Maduro while rewarding his supporters. For critics of the government, it's one more problem to endure. One of Global News' listeners who lives in Venezuela has got in touch to tell us more about how people survive on a day-to-day basis. She wants to remain anonymous, so one of our producers has recorded her words.
We're into hyperinflation. We're seriously short of cash. And because of hyperinflation, small denomination notes just aren't used. So we need higher denomination ones. And criminals take advantage of this. They collect the cash, take it over the border into Colombia or Brazil, set up trestle tables and openly sell them for 2, 3 or even 4 times their value. The new banknotes, which haven't arrived yet, are said to be backed by the petro, a Venezuelan cryptocurrency not even recognised by most other countries, including the US. There's a severe and frightening shortage of medicine. People are dying of curable diseases. It's affecting chemotherapy for cancer. People with epilepsy, diabetes and schizophrenia have no access to treatment. There's a shortage of professionals. Doctors, dentists, surgeons, professors, teachers, lawyers, they're all emigrating en masse. Millions of ordinary Venezuelans are emigrating. Schools are suffering due to a lack of staff, no cleaning or maintenance, and a total lack of supplies. Many children are just leaving school. Washing powder for clothes is hard to get and very expensive, as is hand soap. Deodorant, shampoo and toothpaste are now often unaffordable luxuries. Crime is basically out of control. All my friends have been mugged, robbed or express kidnapped at some point in the past 3 years, some more than once. I can no longer go out on my own to the shops or to have a coffee in the plaza like I used to. Water is scarce. Most homes have running water for an hour or 2 a day unless they have a tank. Many homes go for weeks with no running water at all, and the quality of the water has noticeably deteriorated. Electricity is admittedly cheap, but it's also scarce. The power company can't keep up with the demand because of poor maintenance, a lack of spare parts, and because their staff have emigrated. There are frequent and lengthy power cuts in most of the country. Refuse collection has all but ceased. Trucks are broken down and employees are deserting. It's common to see people go through the garbage looking for something to eat. Many families are becoming incommunicado. Thieves regularly steal telephone cables because of the copper in them, leaving whole urbanisations or housing projects with no landlines. The 3 mobile phone companies are cheap, but the service is very poor because the antennae are chopped down so the metal can be sold. Gasoline is also cheap. It's so cheap it's almost free. But this is a real problem in all states which border another country where there are acute shortages, because millions of gallons are smuggled over the border and sold for many times the price. In our recent trip out west, we passed so many closed or empty petrol stations, which was really scary as the needle edged towards empty, and we had to queue for hours to fill up our tank when we did find one. Finally, there are food shortages. Factories aren't producing things like rice, flour, sugar and pasta. All my friends, without exception, have lost a lot of weight.
That was a Global News listener in Venezuela who wishes to remain anonymous. Vaping could cause severe breathing difficulties. That's according to new research which suggests it could lead to long-term damage to the lungs. Here's our health correspondent, James Gallagher.
Scientists collected the vapour from an e-cigarette, cooled it, then used it to bathe cells donated from the lungs of healthy people. The study in the journal Thorax showed even low doses of vapour led to damaging changes in the lungs' immune cells. The research team said there may be long-term consequences and that these alterations could culminate in diseases that cause severe breathing difficulties. Yet, they've measured changes for only 48 hours in a disease that takes decades to manifest. It will take years of studying vapours to know the truth. The researchers said it was right to think sceptically about e-cigarettes. Public Health England said vaping was not risk-free, but was clearly much less harmful than smoking, and it urged smokers to switch without delay.
James Gallagher, our health correspondent. This week on Global News, we're looking at how different countries across the world are dealing with the growing problem of plastic pollution. On Monday's PM edition, we had a report from New York, and today Rahul Tandon reports from the Indian city of Kolkata.
It's 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm walking on the street outside my flat in Kolkata. There's no one here except for me and some geese who are pecking at the waste which is all around me. There's plastic absolutely everywhere. Bottles, little cups that people drink their chai or tea in. Let's just walk over here, pick up this bit of plastic. That's an empty packet that used to be full of the flour that people make their chapatis with. And this is the problem in India. Everyone loves to use plastic, but then they just chuck it on the streets. Kolkata is now waking up and there's lots of traffic on the main roads. India has 14 out of the 15 most polluted cities in the world, and plastic is a problem in all of them. With me here is Banani Kaka. She's from a group that's trying to clean up this city. It's not an easy job.
People don't understand. They just throw it and they think it'll disappear. It's like a riptide of plastic all along the coast of India, everywhere. In the city, our drains are clogged with plastic. And it's just become so compacted that they have to take a pickaxe to break that barrier of plastic. And the habit of picking up your own garbage and depositing in the right place, in India that doesn't work. Their homes are clean, and then everything which is not in their house, they want to throw out.
The government, though, is waking up to the fact that there is so much rubbish on streets like this. Here's the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi.
Plastic now threatens to become a menace to humanity. Plastic pollution is already having a deadly impact on our marine ecosystem.
I've come to one of Kolkata's most famous fruit and veg markets, and here you get a sense of the scale of the problem. Rani's doing a brisk business selling mangoes. A few years ago, everybody here would carry jute bags to put their fruit and vegetables in. She says things are now very different.
Nobody brings their own bags anymore. They all want plastic bags for free. If I don't give them a plastic bag, they say they will go to another shop instead.
Time to get away from the plastic pollution and have a cup of tea, which of course now is served in a small plastic cup. With me here is the writer Sandeep Roy.
India has been in the throes of a plastic revolution for a long time, and it has certainly embraced plastic with great gusto. Plastic has unfortunately become kind of second nature to Indians, so it's very hard to let go of plastic. The government can put in laws and say like, oh, you mustn't use plastic bags that are less than 40 microns thick. But if you talk to the person selling potatoes and onions on the street, he has no idea about what's 40 microns and what's 60 microns.
A number of Indian states have now banned plastic, but whilst the law's in place, it's rarely enforced. 70% of total plastic waste in India is just thrown away and not recycled. So what does India need to do to tackle the problem?
People are not aware enough. They don't know the impact they are having, when they throw a packet on the ground.
What about fining people for that sort of behaviour?
I don't think we can find anyone here right now.
Plastic is not bad. Misuse of plastic is bad. You cannot survive without plastics. Making a demon out of plastic is really not good.
Definitely they should be fined.
That report by Rahul Tandon on the problem of plastic waste in India. And that's all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Nick Miles, and until next time, goodbye.